Why is a Canadian guy fighting in Ukraine against Russian aggression in a Belarusian unit?
Well, I can't speak for all the Canadian fighters that are in Ukraine because there's a lot of them, but the reason I'm there is I despise dictators, and I don't think anyone should have to live under a dictatorship. So that's why I went to Ukraine, because there's probably the greatest dictator in history is trying to invade it right now, Vladimir Putin, and I knew I could help them stop him. The reason I ended up fighting with a Belarusian unit is because I was well aware of what was going on in Belarus in 2020 during the elections, and when I saw that as a huge loss for democracy, because I think we had a chance to get rid of a man who calls himself Europe's last dictator, Lukashenko. That's not me saying that, he says that about himself. So when I got to Ukraine and I was looking for a unit to join, because there are several units of foreign fighters in Ukraine, I met a Ukrainian guy who told me that the Belarusians had a very organized unit. I knew they had been fighting there since 2014, 2015, with the Ukrainian units, you know what I mean? With the Ukrainian army regiments. But I hadn't realized that the Kalinowski regiment had become so organized. So when I went to meet their officers that are in charge, I already wanted to fight with them, because I knew that they're true believers the way I am, and I didn't actually have to explain they never asked me, like, why do you even want to join the unit? I just showed up and said, I want to help Ukraine defeat Putin, and then I want to help you guys take your country from Lukashenko. So that's why I ended up there. I guess you could just say I was already a true believer when I got there, and then when I met them, it was a very easy decision to make.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Do you have military experience in Canada?
I do, yes, quite a bit actually. I was in the Canadian Army for 15 years as an infantry officer, and I had deployed and worked with the Ukrainians after February of 2022. I was in part of the Advise and Assist mission that the international community put together in the opening weeks of the war. So I had already worked with them before that as well in Canada. I didn't just show up in Ukraine there's a lot of Westerners and a lot of even fighters that had been in NATO militaries who had spent time in the military, but I don't think they understood the nature and the seriousness of this conflict the way that I did. So after almost a year of watching them fight and watching the international community struggle to figure out how to respond, I just decided that I knew that I could help. I was already talking to Ukrainians in Ukraine while they were being invaded, guys in the military, and I knew that as long as I got there, I didn't know what I'd end up doing, but I knew that I could help.
So you've been serving for 15 years as an
since 2008,
infantry officer in Canada, and after you left the army in Canada, and before you joined the war in Ukraine, what was you doing? What was your occupation?
It was a very short period. I left the Canadian military on March 31st of 2023, and I was
2023.
Yes, yeah. So I got back from deployment at the end of 2022. I submitted my paperwork saying that I'm leaving the Canadian military, and my last day was on March 31st. And then on the night of April 14th, 15th, I crossed into Ukraine. It was Easter weekend, so I met up with a Ukrainian family that lives in Kyiv, who some Canadians introduced me to. I went to Easter Mass with them that night. We spent 5 hours standing in the cathedral in downtown Kyiv, and then the next day I just packed my stuff up. I went and moved into an apartment with some other foreigners that were there volunteering, and then the day after that was the first day the headquarters was open. I went and submitted my paperwork to join the Legion. So the period between when I left the Canadian military and when I was joining the Ukrainian International Legion was only like 16 days or 17 days.
Do you participate in this unit or subunit called Kushka Unit? named by this general who is fighting, who's fighting in Poland and United States?
No.
So
I've heard of them, but no.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So you're part of one of these battalions, Volod Battalion and Litvan Battalion.
So I joined Litvan Battalion right when I got there because they were just outside Bakhmut. When I got there is basically when Bakhmut was at the highest pitch of the fighting, and Litvan was already there. So I had one short meeting with the leadership from the regiment, and I told them my background. I said, as an infantry officer, I'm very comfortable. Like, get me into a trench with your soldiers, and and I'll figure it out from there. So I went directly with Litvin, but then since then I've worked with Volot, and I've also worked with some of the smaller teams that do drones and fire support and things like that as well. But I consider Litvin my home unit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what you've been doing during this months of fighting in Ukraine, after you came to Ukraine and before you make this break and you went abroad?
For the first few months I was in the east, so we were actually just outside Klishchivka, which is once Bakhmut fell and Wagner was sort of starting to implode, we ended up just on the south side of Bakhmut, outside it's a small settlement really, it's not even a town, called Klishchivka. So that's where we're fighting in the spring and the beginning of the summer. And then so by that point, I had been working with Litvin for a while. We'd done several ops together. The team leaders knew who I was. The officer in charge knew who I was. So then when Prigozhin had his little insurrection there, when that ended, he was supposedly going to Belarus. That's where he was going to go hide out, and Wagner was going to move to Belarus. So that obviously became a big deal for all of us in the Belarusian unit. So at that point, I went back to Kyiv to meet with the officers and say, like, hey, I think I can help more than just digging a trench, you know what I mean? And I'm also worried about what if Wagner moves to Belarus, what that means for the war, because it's not only bad for Belarus, but had it ended up happening, it would have been very bad for Ukraine, right? Because now Wagner is on the northern flank of Ukraine, and quite frankly, in my opinion, Wagner are they're by far the most violent and barbaric soldiers the Russians had, but they're also the best soldiers the Russians had, which is why we were fighting them so long and hard. So I was very worried about that. So in the middle of the summer then, I went back to the headquarters and started doing more of an officer role, helping with planning and things like that. And then at the end of the summer, we moved to the east, to the Kupiansk region, which is where we were fighting all fall, right up until I left.
From the perspective of time, what do you think about this operation in Bakhmut, from the Ukrainian perspective? Was it a good idea, to hold the Bakhmut for such a long time? I do, yeah. I actually have very strong opinions about this, and my mind changed while it was going on, because like everybody else, especially NATO-trained military planners, I didn't understand why they were making such a big deal out of Bakhmut. Russians or Ukrainians?
Both sides. Just strategically, it really didn't seem to make sense to me. But then when I got there and I saw the cost that it was imposing on the Russians, I started to understand why the Ukrainians just made that. They just put a line in the sand and said, we're holding this for as long as we can, or as long as it takes. And I would ultimately say, I think strategically it did turn out to make sense, because Wagner very much was the most dangerous force that the Russians had. And Wagner imploded because of Bakhmut, right? If you remember that video, basically as the town fell, as they finally secured the last block, that video where Prigozhin is standing there with all his guys behind him and he's saying, where's my fucking ammunition and all that? That really was the Wagner culminated, is a word we use in English. They reached the best that they could do at that point, and then they just imploded and became completely dysfunctional. And I don't think that would have happened if they hadn't held the ground in Bakhmut. So I don't think it was a strategic, maybe, you know, General Zaluzhny and Budanov and them, maybe that was their plan all along, I don't know. But ultimately, the good news is 6 months later, a year later, we're not fighting Wagner anymore.
Yeah, there are no Wagner then.
Yeah,
Wagner
yeah. And hopefully they don't come back. And I think also, you know, Wagner's role in the first half of the war, like they were supposed to be trainers and advisors, and basically they were supposed to be helping produce more Russian soldiers. They were not supposed to be doing the fighting themselves. But because the Ukrainians decided we're making this stand here, they forced Wagner to come fight them. And now the Russians have lost the capability of using those, all those guys that had experience in Syria, experience in Africa. Those guys aren't making more of them, more of themselves, and more Russian soldiers. So I think that, you know, when I was standing in a trench last May, you know, I thought it was stupid. I was like, this is dumb. You know, but then fast forward 6 months later, you know, now we don't have to worry about Prigozhin anymore.
But we are Belarusians, we have to worry about some Wagner fighters, because the part of them are they are back to Africa.
Yeah.
But some of them, they're still in
go to
Belarus.
Yeah.
They're training Belarusian Lukashenko forces.
Yeah.
Do we have to worry about them?
I think so, yeah. I wouldn't be super worried until you saw another leader kind of start to consolidate power, because the real thing that kept Wagner together was the force of Prigozhin's personality. I don't think they're very organized without him, but if you started to see another guy like that who was essentially a mercenary leader come into power, especially if he was using Belarus as his base, as his stronghold, then I think we, like, not you and I would have to worry, like the world needs to worry, because I don't think the average person who only knows this war from reading it in the New York Times, or they don't realize how dangerous and evil Wagner was, you know. So I would say that is a huge threat to, you know, like regional stability in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and Africa, because that was Prigozhin's plan, was to destabilize all those areas. And, you know, the people who think like him, like there's lots of them still around. Luckily, they're not very organized or smart, but they are still around.
What was your first contacts with Belarusian fighters in Ukraine? When you came to this unit, when you came to some positions or to base, how it was looks like? Your first talks?
Yeah,
jokes?
The first day, there was me and one other guy. We drove out to their kind of, you know, where they lived, and we met for like maybe an hour, and we had, you know, we had to struggle through language barrier and stuff like that. And then they said, we're going to the range tomorrow and then deploying the day after. Are you coming with us? And we were like, heck yeah, we're coming with you. So we went to the range for one day. We all shot together. And then the next day we were on the top of a BMP riding to the trenches. And then that was the rest of the spring right there. That's, you know, and it was, I would say, it was a very good experience, because, you know, most people who have never really soldiered don't realize, like, soldiering is actually something that you bond very quickly. You know what I mean? No regard, even if you don't speak the same language, you know what I mean? Like if you're trying to stay awake at night and some guy who only speaks Belarusian brings you a cup of coffee, you're immediately friends. You know what I mean? You don't need to speak the same language. And then over time, you know, you earn each other's trust, and you have a lot of, you know, like you start thinking the same way. And so I would say the first couple ops I did were all that. They're exciting and fun, and like I felt like I was immediately accepted. I didn't really feel like they weren't treating me like I was an outsider or anything. Just the fact that I was there was good enough. And yeah, and then maybe a few weeks after that, the counteroffensive started for real. And then we actually started to take ground towards Klishchivka, and then eventually we did take Klishchivka. So it was a very positive experience. And as I said before, like I've been doing this a long time. I've been doing this my entire adult life. 22-year-old soldiers are all basically the same. they're cold and tired, and they're not really sure what's going on, but you know, they like doing their job, you know. So, and I was very comfortable being with them.
What are Belarusians like? Do you feel any differences in, you know, character, psychology between Ukrainians and Belarusians in Ukraine?
Yeah, there's some, like, I very much feel, actually you should divide that group even further, because there's the Belarusians that have come to Ukraine to fight since February of 2022, but then there's several guys who have been there for years before that, since 2014, 15, 16, and they're kind of like three different groups. So the guys that have been there a long time, it's not new to them. Like, the war is not new to them. It was new to Westerners in February of 2022, but it wasn't new to them. And that's a very different mindset than the Belarusians that have come there since February of 2022, because everything is kind of the first time they're experiencing it, right? Most of them were not soldiers beforehand. It's a lot of IT professionals or guys that had normal jobs. So the Belarusians that have been there a long time are actually more like the Ukrainians. Like, they kind of understand, like, they understand how the Russian army fights, and they understand what's at stake and how serious things can get and how quickly things can get very dangerous. Whereas the Belarusians that have come just in the last 2 years, it's slightly different mentality because they don't have that experience. And the other thing I would say is, you know, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives and for their country. The Belarusians are very much aware, like, this is just the first fight. Once this fight's over, they got to take their country as well. So they think in a much longer term, you know what I mean? When you can tell when you talk to them, like, they're planning further out. They think, like, they understand this is how their life is going to be for a long time. So their level of commitment is extremely high. Not to say that the Ukrainian level of commitment isn't extremely high, but there is a slight psychological difference between knowing this is just the first war. There's another war coming after it.
Do you remember any interesting or curious or funny situations, you know, regarding your colleagues from the Kalinowski regiment?
Yeah, there is this. This is the funniest story. I was serving in a trench outside Klishchivka with a guy. I won't say his name on TV, but people in the regiment will know who he is. He's a funny guy. He spoke enough English that we could, like, hold a conversation. So I always ended up with him. And one night, we were out, I think, doing an op mission that was like 4 or 5 days long. And the first night, I had to get out of the trench to go to the bathroom, and this tank showed up and shot at us. And I, you know, ran to get back in the trench. And then the second night, the same thing happened. We had tea or whatever, and then I got out of the trench to go to the bathroom, and this tank showed up and shot at us. So he told me, he's like, you can't go to the bathroom anymore for the rest of the week. You're not allowed to get out of the trench, because every time you try to go to the bathroom, a tank shows up and shoots at us. So that became like the running joke. It was like his team was gonna die because I always had to pee.
Did you learn the Russians? Have you seen the Russians in Ukraine?
On the battlefield, you mean?
On the battlefield, I don't know, prisoners of war.
Yeah, you've seen them, but you don't see them as much as you'd think. You see them through drones all the time, but quite frankly, they don't. You know, it's so hard to explain. Like, they'll show up and shoot at us, and we're shooting back, but it's not like you see them running. It's not like an action movie. You know what I mean? It's not Hollywood. Like, you don't see them run around all the time. You definitely do see detainees and prisoners of war, but that is, to my knowledge, I haven't seen anyone in the regiment handling that. The Ukrainians handle that. So when we take them, it's over to the Ukrainians, because it's, you know, legally it's their war, and they abide by the laws of armed conflict, and they do detain prisoners of war and then try to exchange them back for their own guys or whatever. So we see them, and they are around, and I've, you know, been around while they're organizing prisoner exchanges and stuff, but I haven't interacted with any of them.
What did you learn about Russians in Ukraine? to compare with your, imaginations about Russians before the war.
Yeah.
What is the difference between your imagination about Russians and your, the truth about Russians in Ukraine?
The thing that just blows my mind all the time is they just have absolutely no value for their own soldiers' lives. Like, they send their guys to die over and over and over again, and they keep doing it, right? Like, they attack us, if we'll be in a position with like a Ukrainian unit on either side of us or whatever, the Russians will come at us and they'll meet like just a wall of bullets, right? Or mortar rounds or whatever it is. And they all get killed. And then 12 hours later, they come back and try the exact same thing. You know what I mean? Like, knowing full well, like, their friends walked through this tree line, and then we killed them all. And then they go do it again the next day and the day after, and over and over and over again. So the thing that, it's not that I really thought about Russians, but I thought about the Russian army a lot as a NATO, officer, is like, I would have just assumed they would have some kind of like casualty calculator or something that says, if you try this every day for 15 days in a row and all of your guys get killed, don't try it anymore. But they just keep trying it. They just keep doing it. And we make fun of it in English, the human wave attacks, where they throw waves of bodies at things. But that's not us making it up. They actually do that. And I just can't, as a military leader and officer and thinker, you just imagine telling a platoon of soldiers, you're just going to run over there and get killed. Like, we know you're going to get killed. Every platoon that's gone before you for the last week has gotten killed. Eventually you would think, like, even if you don't respect the lives of your soldiers, like, that's how you lose a war. You know what I mean? So that is the one thing that it never ceases to amaze me, how they just don't value the lives of their soldiers. The leaders just don't value the lives of their soldiers. And I can't imagine being in an army like that. Like, who would want to fight for that,
I think that the strategy of Ukrainian generals, at least during the last few months, was to make as much losses for Russians as it possible, maximum losses.
Yeah.
So they
call
will
it
be
imposing
able,
cost in English.
So there will be not just that Putin will see on calculator that there are 500,000. Okay, we will stop. No, not about that. It's about that Russia will not be able to rebuild the army after that.
Yeah.
Do you think it is effective in the perspective of the next months and years?
It depends what you mean by effective. I think that, like, long term it is effective, because if you force your enemy to overcommit resources to a fight, it lessens his ability to fight in the future, whether it's fighting you or fighting someone else. So long term, it is effective. But I think that, and I'm not sure that was the avowed strategy, like if that was the strategic goal, or if it was just something that was happening, because I do think it was definitely happening the way you described it. I would say, at least amongst policymakers in places like Washington and London and whatnot, there is this mistaken idea that if the Ukrainians continue to impose this kind of cost on their human resources, that it will somehow sap the political will in Russia to continue fighting.
It doesn't work.
Like, if you kill enough Russian soldiers, Russian mothers will go confront their political leaders and say, please end this war, we don't want our sons to die. I just don't believe that's true. I don't think it's happening. So it might be, as you say, limiting the physical resources that they have to go fight more or invade another country or whatever, because we are killing their people, destroying their vehicles, you know what I mean? But I don't think it's negatively affecting the political will of Russian society to continue this fight. I think it's actually galvanizing. I think it's actually making it worse. The more of them you kill, the more they're going to send to fight, which is just, like, makes no sense You know, my country and the U.S. and a lot of the Western powers, we just spent 20 years fighting the global war on terror, and we didn't sustain nearly the number of casualties that Russia is sustaining, and Ukraine are sustaining in this war. And our political will to fight, it took 2 decades, but eventually it did dry up. Eventually citizens had no idea why we were there, and they ended those missions. And I don't see it happening in Russia anytime soon. This is a long war.
After this interview, you are going back to Ukraine?
I am, yeah.
After more than 1 month of rest? What kind of thoughts you have in your head now when you are going back to Ukraine after this break?
I really want to get back on the ground and see what my team is doing and how they're doing, where they're fighting, because you know I do feel guilty that I can leave the country. Like I wanted to, you know, see my family, see my wife and whatnot, but like they couldn't leave. Like they're right. I'm not exactly sure where they are right now because of operational security, but they're still there fighting, you know, and it's February in Ukraine. Like it's winter, it's cold. So as soon as I get back, I just want to find out where they are, what they're doing, and get back with them because I should be there helping them.
I know that except you are fighting, you are sacrificing your time, energy, your knowledge, your life, I hope not. But you're also trying to organize some support for Ukraine. What do you want to tell to the world, to the people in the West who are tired about the war news after 2 years? How we can, you know, mobilize the public opinion again when we see the troubles on the front line?
Yeah.
We see that United States, they are still blocking this huge package of support for Ukraine.
I will answer your question, but I just want to clarify something about that. There is a very small block of politicians in America who are making it impossible for the funding and the military support to continue to Ukraine right now. And it's very small. I think it's maybe 10 or 12 congressmen. I don't believe they represent American.
I mean, MAGA, Make America Great Again.
Well, they're Republican
faction.
senators, yeah. And I don't want to. As a military officer, I try really hard to not get like comment on politics because that's not my job.
But we're speaking about, you know,
yeah. But
people,
I do think America is still behind Ukraine. The support will come. They're having the same political. You know how in English, whenever one politician doesn't like what another politician's doing, they always say like, oh, he's playing politics with Ukraine, or he's playing politics with this or that. That's what politicians do. Like they try to play politics to their own advantage, and Ukraine's become a giant lever that if you can control the funding, you know, and the support to it, it is a huge lever to play politics with. It's going on in my country in Canada, it's going on in the US, it's going on in all of the NATO countries. But I honestly don't believe that America has suddenly decided they support Russia and don't support Ukraine. Like I just don't believe it. And then the answer to your broader question, what I would say to anyone that can listen, is that the world right now is, you know, for a long time, for the last 75, 80 years since World War II, we developed kind of into 2 camps. There's one camp that thinks, you know, we can sort our problems out through talking, and we can have the rule of law, and we can have free and fair elections, and even if we don't like each other, don't like each other's ideas or political positions, we can somehow coexist and arrive at like mutually beneficial ways of living together. And there's another group of people that just don't believe that, right? Dudes like Putin just don't believe that. If we're living well, he's living poorly. It's a zero-sum game to him, right? If Ukraine joins the EU, his life is somehow worse. You know what I mean? If Belarus doesn't live under Lukashenko's dictatorial regime, his life is somehow worse. And the people like him, who think like him, are completely willing to use fear and violence to impose their will on others. And what I would say is the first group of people right, who think they can resolve their problems through talking, they need to realize like there is no talking solution with someone who thinks they can use violence to impose their will on you. And if you try to sit down and negotiate with him, he's just gonna kill you and take your stuff. Like that's what they do, you know? So all of the strategies that we use to resolve our differences in the democratic world, they don't apply in this fight right now. And the world's dictators have seen like the international community starts to break down when they're confronted by someone like from the second group, someone like Putin. And my fear is that, you know, you're gonna start to see copycats like him popping up all over the world. We're already seeing, you know, like Hamas thinks like him, right? And the Houthis think like him, right? And I'm sure they felt emboldened by watching the world crack under the pressure of supporting Ukraine, you know. And they're just they're the low-level players. They're not Iran. They're not Xi Jinping. You know what I mean? There's real forces of evil and violence that are coming for us. And if you live comfortably in Western Europe or the US or Canada, I might sound like a conspiracy theorist or extremist or whatever, but I would say like use your own eyes. Just look at the evidence. You know, like this war is not going away. It's only getting worse. And I fully believe there's another war going to start in 2024. And, you know, we have to, like, show some leadership and some courage to stand up to, you know, people in that group that think it's okay to use violence to impose your own anti-human agenda on others, you know. And that's why everyone was so shocked in February of 2022 when the Ukrainians stood up to them. Like we were all, like, I don't know what it was like here in Poland, but I know in Canada the news story wasn't Ukraine stands up to Russia. It was like, oh my God, they're actually doing it and they're winning and they're beating them back, you know. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but that's, yeah.
Do you think that Ukraine can still win?
Absolutely.
For us Belarusians, it's also important.
Yep.
Because we don't see possibility to liberate Belarus, to bring back democracy, rule of law, normal life in Belarus, if Putin will, you know, occupy Ukraine. You know how the Kalinowski fighters, they're saying, we're liberating Belarus by liberating of Ukraine.
Yes.
Do you think it is possible?
Absolutely do. I think that's why I'm going back. And not only do I think it's possible, I think it's imperative. Like, they have to win. And I would also say, and I hope my Belarusian friends back in Ukraine don't get mad at me for saying this, but I also thought like Ukraine has to win so that Belarus can eventually be free. I'm starting to think it might need to be the other way around. You know what I mean? Like the Belarusian election is next year. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya already proved that, you know, if given the chance, Belarusians will vote, will like demand the rule of law and their own dignity. And I think that if Putin saw that, you know, he, in military terms, he was heavily reliant on the territory of Belarus to launch his invasion, right? So if you think back to 2020, if 2020 had come out different, if Svetlana was or her husband was in Lukashenko's chair right now, I don't think Russia would have been able to launch its invasion. They may have ramped up operations in Donbass and Crimea in the east and whatnot, but they wouldn't have been able to flank Kyiv from the north and then send a convoy all the way down to Kyiv. So, you know, it's not to say that I don't think it might go Ukraine first, then Belarus, but it might be the other way around as well. If you want to contain Russia's ability to project force into Europe, you know, Belarus is a key piece of that. You might actually need to, you know, remind Belarusian citizens it's like a huge part of the problem and why Russia can threaten, you know, the free world so much is because he just treats their country as his playground. You know what I mean? Like he just relies, he's like, yeah, I'll just send an entire army group to hang out in Belarus for 3 months while we get ready for this invasion, you know? So military, where the point where politics meets military strategy, I would say, had our politicians in the NATO countries realized in 2020 is like, if we can figure out how to coerce Lukashenko to recognize that he lost the election, you might be stopping a Russian invasion. Oh, I mean, you would have been stopping a Russian invasion. You know, we have to start explaining it in those terms so that, you know, your average news reader understands them, and why you can't just see like, oh, another revolution in some country far away that I don't even know where it is on the map. Like, this stuff really matters, you know.
David, at the end I want to thank you that you came from the other side of the world to defend Ukraine, side by side with my friends, with my colleagues,
my brothers,
Belarusians, warriors who are fighting for Ukraine. And you know that Canada, it's also important for Belarusians. It's a home, it's a second home for many Belarusians, migrants, since the 100 years and the time after the World War II and so on. And I knew some Belarusians from Canada who are supporting Kalinowski regiment with donations, for example. So thank you for that, and I hope to see you soon again, maybe in Warsaw, maybe in Ukraine.
Of course.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. See you, man.